The new Netflix series, The Fall of the House of Usher from Mike Flanagan, takes its name from one of Edgar Allan Poe's most famous short stories. It doesn't just retell that story, though. The series is packed with details from a wide variety of Poe's stories and poems. So much so that when I was watching it, I found myself looking stuff up every few minutes. I should explain that I'm not a Poe expert. My experience with his work was reading and liking The Raven in middle school, and then hearing that he was this crazy guy who wrote creepy stories because he was hooked on drinking absinthe, which caused hallucinations. It turns out that that wasn't exactly true, and I'll actually get into where those ideas came from in the first place a little bit later in this video. And I guess you can't blame me for not knowing that the psychedelic properties of absinthe were highly exaggerated when I was 12 years old. Even as someone who didn't know a ton about Poe going into this, the one thing I noticed right away was the familiar sounding titles of the episodes. Episode 1 is titled A Midnight Dreary, which is the first line in his famous narrative poem, The Raven. Since that is also the name of the series finale, I'll come back to that when we get there, but I should mention that the name Verna is an anagram of Raven. There are quite a few references from episode 1 to mention. The very first one that jumped out at me was the eulogy during the opening scene at the funeral. The delivery feels unconventional, which makes it stand out and makes you want to start paying attention. I looked up the beginning, which is from a poem called For Annie. This is a poem he wrote for his friend Nancy L. Haywood, who helped him recover from an illness and taught him that there was still hope. This is only the first part, though. The priest also reads a passage here from the poem Spirits of the Dead, which he reads again during the funeral of the first 3 kids, and then Verna reads this over the closing shot of the cemetery. In that, Poe describes death as a great mystery, but also contends that there is a beauty in it that should be appreciated. After that, there are lines that are taken from the short story The Premature Burial, which you could probably tell from this series is something that Poe had an interest in, and a story called The Imp of the Perverse, which is about people committing acts against their self-interest. In the middle of the eulogy, Lenore is worried about her grandfather, and when she addresses him, she calls him Grampus. They'll also use this as a name when she builds a ship in a bottle with her dad in episode 2. Grampus is the name of a ship that the main character stows away on in Poe's only full-length novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. Pym is also the name of the family's loyal and seemingly unbeatable lawyer who took part in the Transglobe expedition. The novel involves a long adventure, or maybe misadventure would be a better way to describe it, but it ends abruptly before the main characters reach the South Pole. The book also references the Hollow Earth theory, which was something the Pym Reaper mentioned to the Usher children in the show. Poe took influence from John Cleves Sims Jr., who came up with the idea that there were entrances to the inner world at the poles. I don't know how invested in this theory Poe was beyond writing this book, but there are many myths across cultures that involve civilizations that live underground. Pym also said that there was an island at the North Pole called Ultima Thule, the realm of beings who live beneath us out of time and out of space. This makes you think about Verna, and when they have their chat in episode 8, she seems to confirm that that's where she's from. Almost all of the names in the series have connections to Poe's writing. I'll go through each of the main characters in a separate section, but there were 2 in this episode that stood out. First was the name of the pharmaceutical company Fortunato. This is the name of a character in the short story The Cask of Amontillado, which is about a person being buried alive. Poor Fortunato is lured into a wine cellar where he's walled in and left to die, which also sounds a lot like the way Rufus Griswold dies in the show. The second name was a little harder to find. Obviously, there isn't a character named Ligadone in any of Poe's work, but I did come across the story titled Ligeia that happens to be about an opium addict. The main character has bad luck with wives dying, and when he loses his second one, she comes back to life transformed into his first one, which all makes you wonder if he might just be hallucinating while he's high. There are 2 side characters that are worth mentioning in episode 1 as well, Roderick and Madeline's parents. They are somewhat unique in that they're not named after characters, but instead real people from Poe's life. Their father, William Longfellow, is named after Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who was a contemporary writer whom Poe hated. He even went as far as publicly accusing him of plagiarism. Their mother, Eliza Usher, is named after Poe's mother, who was an actress. She died at an early age, likely of tuberculosis, right in front of him when he was a toddler. Death is a recurring theme in Poe's work. As we go through this, you'll see the death of a woman, of a love, of something beautiful is something he returns to often. Losing his mother at such an early age surely had something to do with that. I've already mentioned 2 stories about being buried alive, which was a real thing people were worried about in Poe's time. It happened often enough that safety coffins were available, with a built-in mechanism just in case you woke up inside one of them 6 feet underground. I suppose Eliza's death is a reference to the story A Premature Burial, but her return to kill Longfellow is also similar to what happens at the end of both the House of Usher story and the TV show. Episode 2 is titled The Mask of the Red Death, which is a short story about a wealthy prince named Prospero, who locks himself and a bunch of other nobles in an abbey to avoid a plague called the Red Death that is wiping everyone out. When they get bored, they decide to hold a masquerade ball where a mysterious character dressed up as a Red Death victim appears like a thief in the night. Prospero finds the costume offensive and demands to know the guest's identity, but this confrontation leaves him dead. When the rest of the guests try to remove the costume, they find out that there's nothing underneath and then they all die from the disease. This is very similar to Prospero Usher's story that we see play out in this episode, and I think this is one of the most effective examples of repurposing the stories. The concept slides right into modern times. Verna's appearance as the Red Death also adds some mystery to the character who already felt like she had a connection to the supernatural. Rufus Griswold is also not a character in Poe's stories or poems, but he is based on a real-life writer whom he had a long-running feud with. After Poe died, Griswold wrote a pretty terrible obituary about him, saying that he had few friends and that he often wandered the streets in madness or melancholy. He then became his literary executor, possibly under suspicious circumstances, and then added a memoir to a collection of Poe's writing he published after his death, where he depicts him as a madman, addicted to drugs and chronically drunk. The memoir became notorious for its inaccuracy, and his character assassination was pretty obvious. It was all mostly debunked, but in a way it actually made Poe's work more popular. Some people, my middle school self included, liked the idea of reading stories that were penned by a madman. Annabelle Lee, the mother of Frederick and Tamerlane, was Roderick's only true love, and honestly one of the only Ushers who was a good person. Her warm outlook and trusting nature always helped her to find the best in Roderick, but it also made her overlook his worst tendencies. Her name comes from a poem called Annabelle Lee, which is about the death of a beautiful woman, and we hear Roderick recite lines from it throughout the series. It says that he had a love for her so strong that even angels are envious. As mentioned, the death of a woman is a recurring theme and something he knew a lot about. His mother died when he was very young, his foster mother died when he was 20, and his wife died when she was only 24. The poem seems to be about his wife who died of tuberculosis 2 years before he wrote it, and it's about how his love remains after she dies. This is one of the things that I came to appreciate about Poe's writing while researching this video. A lot of his writing on death is related through the characters that lived through it, and they're experiencing the loss. Of course, the show puts a spin on this when we learn that its version of Annabelle Lee died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound, at least in part because of Roderick luring her children away, which makes him complicit in his own loss. Episode 3 is called Murder in the Rue Morgue, and that's a short detective story about a man named C. Auguste Dupin who solves the mystery of a double murder. The murderer turns out to be an orangutan, which we see switched out with a chimpanzee in the show. But what's most interesting about this story is that historically, it's considered to be the first modern detective story. Dupin as a character became the inspiration for Sherlock Holmes and Hercule Poirot, and the story introduced literary conventions that would define the genre. You see a glimpse of the character Dupin is based on when he puts together several clues about Roderick and Annabelle after sitting at their table for a short period of time. The show's version has spent most of his adult life trying to bring the Ushers to justice without ever knowing the game was rigged against him, but his book counterpart always gets his man, or his ape as it were, in the handful of stories he appears in. The show's version of Augie also works as the stand-in for the unnamed narrator in the story The Fall of the House of Usher. In Murder in the Rue Morgue, he solves the case of the murder of Camille La España. In the show, this is the name of Roderick's spin doctor daughter, whose gifts for uncovering secrets lead her to an early grave at the hand of one of Victorine's test chimps. In the show, they refer to the testing site as the Rue Morgue, short for Roderick Usher Experimental, but in the book it's just the street name where the murders occurred. One of the funniest things I looked up was the name of her assistant because I thought it stood out how she had a habit of saying Toby Dammit. I don't know why, it just seemed like we were supposed to notice that. It turns out that there's a character named Toby Dammit, as in Dammit is his last name, in Poe's story Never Bet the Devil Your Head. That's a satirical tale that pokes fun at the notion that all literature should have a moral. Another detail in episode 3 that popped out was the name on Verna's badge when she's dressed up as a security guard. It reads Le Bon, which is one of the murder suspects in the Rue Morgue story. Episode 4's title is The Black Cat, which is a short story written from the perspective of an unreliable narrator who's been sentenced to death. He tells the story of a black cat named Pluto that was his favorite pet until it bit him after a night of heavy drinking. As a punishment, he gouges Pluto's eyes out and eventually kills him. Later, he finds a cat that looks almost identical, who is also missing an eye, and it reminds him of him, so he takes it home out of guilt. Over time, it starts to remind him of all the horrible things he'd done, so he tries to kill it with an axe. His wife sees this and tries to stop him, and so he kills her instead, and then hides her corpse by bricking her up inside a wall in the basement. After the incident, the cat goes missing, which gives him relief. But when the police come to search the house for his missing wife, they hear a noise behind the wall he bricked her into, and when they open it, they find the cat and the corpse and arrest him. The show incorporates a lot of this into Leo's story, and also in the episode they mention the name of Dr. Brevet several times. The doctor's name shows up on the forged documents. His name comes from the short story The Man That Was Used Up, about a war hero who was mutilated to the point that much of his body is just prosthetics. Episode 5 is named The Telltale Heart, a short story where an unreliable narrator tries to convince the reader that they couldn't possibly be insane. They do this by describing how they carefully killed an old man who had never done anything wrong to them. The victim had what the narrator called a vulture eye, which is the catalyst for the murder. The narrator makes a plan and follows through with it, where the victim lets out a scream, but otherwise they're able to kill him and dismember his body and hide it under the floorboards. With that amount of precision, how could they be crazy? Neighbors did hear the old man screaming though, so police eventually show up. Confident that they won't find any clues, he sits down for an interview in the same room where the body parts are concealed. It's all going according to plan until the narrator starts to hear a ringing in their ears and becomes convinced that it's the sound of the old man's beating heart coming from under the floor. It gets so intense that he eventually confesses and tells the police to tear up the floor so that they can recover the body. There are many parallels with what Victorine experiences in this episode, not least of which is the beating heart of her dead partner, whose name is a reference to Poe's only play Politian. In that, there's a character named Alessandra, who is in the middle of a love triangle. Episode 6 is titled The Gold Bug, a short story where the main character, William Legrand, gets fascinated with the gold-colored bug he finds. His servant worries that it might have bitten him, and it's making him crazy, so he goes to find one of his friends to have him come and check on him. This leads to William pulling them into an adventure where he solves a secret message that leads them to a buried treasure. Goldbug is the name Tamerlane uses for her Homeo Hipster subscription box service and lifestyle brand. Her husband, Bill T., or Bilt, has the full name of William T. Wilson. He's the face of her brand until he isn't, and his name comes from Poe's short story William Wilson, which features a doppelganger. In the show, Tamerlane likes to hire sex workers who pretend to be her, who look like her, so she can watch them with Bill. This story is also related to Tamerlane's end. In it, Wilson eventually stabs his lookalike, but then starts to see his bloody image as his reflection when he looks in the mirror, just as Tamerlane sees Verna dressed up like her before she does herself in. In a conversation with Lenore in his office, Roderick quotes a Poe poem and a short story. He says, "All that we see or seem is but a dream within a dream," which is from a short poem called A Dream Within a Dream. In that, the narrator experiences confusion as he watches the important things in life slip away. Roderick also says, "Those who dream by day are cognizant of many things which escape those who dream only by night," which is a reference to daydreams, which comes from the short story Eleonora. This is considered to be an autobiographical tale written so that Poe could resolve the guilt for considering other women to love after his wife started to get ill. It's another one that deals with the death of a beautiful woman and also features a visit from beyond the grave like Lagia and Morella. Madeline also delivers a line from Eleanor when she tells Roderick, "Men have called me mad, but the question is not yet settled, whether madness is or is not the loftiest intelligence." At one point, Pym shows Roderick and Madeline the driver's license that Verna gave to Vic for the human trials. On that, her name is Pamela Clem, which is a reference to Poe's wife Virginia Clem, who was also his cousin and 13 years old when they married. There is some discussion that their loving marriage may have been more like a brother-sister relationship, but as I mentioned, he was devastated after she died at the age of 24. The address on the driver's license is 1849 Reynolds Street. 1849 is the year that Poe died, and the doctor who was taking care of him said that he kept calling out for someone named Reynolds on his deathbed. In episode 6, we also see Roderick get his hands on 2 large sapphire eyes that were used in Queen Tussaret's tomb. This leads to one of my favorite monologues from him where he explains the amount of bribes it took to get them, which is probably only outdone by his monologue about lemons. The sapphire eyes, and I suppose all the other references to Egypt and mummification, are a reference to Poe's story Some Words with a Mummy, which was a satirical story where a mummy comes back to life while he's being examined in the 19th century. Episode 7 gets its name from The Pit and the Pendulum, a short story about a character who is tortured in the Spanish Inquisition. It's a rare story for Poe because there are no supernatural elements. Most of what makes it creepy is the way the experience is relayed through the prisoner's senses. He is almost killed by a razor-edged pendulum hanging from the ceiling above him, but as it's getting lower, he's able to rub some food that was left in his cell on his bindings, so that rats will chew through them and he can be freed. In the show, Frederick isn't as lucky, and even if there were rats around, the nightshade paralytic would have made luring them impossible. I didn't find a direct reference to the paralytic that pops up so many times in the series, but its effects do seem to be similar to the symptoms of catalepsy, which is a condition Poe writes about a few different times. Freddie's wife Morella is a reference to a short story with the same name that's about a man who's worried that his daughter might be a reincarnation of his wife who died giving birth to her. Froderick's decision to remove her teeth with a pair of pliers is one of the most disturbing things that happens in the show. And trying to find out if that was something from his work led me to one of Poe's most unsettling tales. In the short story Berenice, the main character watches his fiancée die from a disease that destroys everything except her perfect teeth. One night after she's buried, he wakes up to find that he has a box that's filled with those teeth. It turns out that in a trance, he dug up her body, which, by the way, wasn't dead. She was another victim of being buried alive, but he didn't realize that, so he just continued to tear out her teeth thinking that she was dead. The poem Verna recites to Madeline at their confrontation is Poe's The City in the Sea, which tells the story of a city ruled by death itself. It's another poem that deals with death and presents it in a non-conventional way. I read it a few times and none of what he's describing sounds good, but there's some ambiguity about how he feels about it. Episode 8 is called The Raven, which comes from Poe's narrative poem that tells the story of a mysterious talking raven visiting an unnamed narrator who is mourning the death of his beloved. To say it can talk is a stretch. It only ever says the word nevermore, and this serves to antagonize the narrator who is just sort of trying to figure out why it's there in the first place. As mentioned, he is mourning. It brings up a lot of feelings for him, And at the end, it just sort of perches on the bust of Pallas, who is the Greek goddess of wisdom, and just stays there, giving the narrator the sense that he'll never be free of it. There is raven imagery throughout the series that is mostly connected to Verna. Lenore is also the name of the narrator's lost love in the poem, which is in line with Roderick's granddaughter, whom he lost at the end of the last episode. Poe also wrote a poem called Lenore, which is about, you guessed it, the death of a young woman. On the show, Lenore is the only Usher who took after Annabelle Lee, and the only one you truly felt sorry for when she died. Even Verna felt bad about it, and she did it in a merciful way. She was Roderick's favorite because he saw what he loved about his deceased wife in her, and she was the final loss that he had to go through that was necessary for him to keep up his end of the deal. In episode 8, we finally understand why Roderick is ignoring the text that he's been getting from her since the beginning of his sit-down with Dupin. Earlier in the series, we saw that she completed a lengthy questionnaire so that Madeline could use her for a beta test of her digital immortality machine. It still doesn't work as planned, though, leading to the Lenore bot spamming his messages with variations of the word nevermore, which again is the only thing the Raven answers in the poem. We also finally find out how the Ushers got Rufus Griswold out of the way so that they could take over Fortunato. In a flashback, we see him dressed as a jester at Fortunato's New Year's party, which is a reference to the short story Hop Frog, about a dwarf who serves as a court jester that turns the tables on his king and his court in an act of revenge. Griswold is bricked up behind the basement wall, just like the character Fortunato in The Cask of Amontillado. When Roderick finally reveals to Dupin that Lenore is dead, he recites the Raven's opening line, which brings us full circle to the title of the first episode. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, when I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door, only this and nothing more. The end of the show invokes the story that it's named after. In that, Roderick Usher is suffering from an unspecified illness and invites his friend to visit. His twin sister Madeline is also ill with catalepsy, which causes her to experience death-like trances. After some time, Roderick informs his visitor that his sister has died and asks for his help to entomb her below their house. Of course, she's not dead and eventually escapes to attack her brother, scaring him to death. As the visitor flees, he watches the House of Usher split in two and sink into a lake. In the show, Madeline returns to kill her twin brother, and they're both buried under the house after it falls. This completes the deal they made, and Verna appears as Dupin leaves and then turns into the Raven and flies away. For the kids' names I haven't mentioned yet, Frederick, the oldest, is a reference to a character in the first short story that Poe had printed, called Metzengerstein, a tale in imitation of the German. This is probably also where the name Metzer, the chemist who created Ligodone, came from. It's fitting for Roderick's first child's name to come from Poe's first published work. That's a story about a family in a long-running feud. Frederick is suspected of starting a fire that killed the other family's patriarch, and through a series of events finds himself intrigued and then almost addicted to riding this horse that he just happens upon. The implication is that the horse is his victim, and when Frederick's own house catches on fire, the horse carries him into the flames. So this is a story about being done in by one's own hubris. Tamerlane is a reference to a poem of the same name. The main character, Tamerlane, puts aside the love he has for a peasant in order to achieve power. When he dies, he recalls his decision as building a kingdom in exchange for a broken heart. Victorine is a reference to Mademoiselle Victorine Lafourcade from The Premature Burial, which I've mentioned a few times by now. She put her true love aside to marry for money, and her rich husband turned out to be cruel. Eventually, she died and was buried, and her true love came back with a broken heart so heavy that he decided to dig up her body so that he could keep a lock of her hair. This probably won't come as a big surprise this far into the video, but as it turns out, she wasn't dead after all. Napoleon, or Leo for short, is a reference to the short story The Spectacles. It's about a 22-year-old named Napoleon who needs glasses but just refuses to wear them. He goes out and falls in love with a beautiful woman who he tries to describe to a friend. Things get mixed up where he thinks they're going to get together, but it turns out to be a much older relative who's playing a trick on him. She's 82 years old and found out that he had mistaken her for a much younger woman and went as far as staging a wedding where she told him to wear his glasses. In the end, it all worked out though, and I think that's a great place to leave things. I tried to get all the references, but I'm sure I missed some, so let me know in the comments what you came up with. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.